where you wake up, it's sunny outside, and maybe you have some email or some things to take care of, or maybe you didn't sleep that well the night before, and so you stay indoors. You don't change anything about your breakfast. You don't change anything about your within home temperature or anything like that. And somewhere right around 10 or 11 o'clock, you start feeling kind of chilled, like you're cold. Well, what happened was the oscillators, the clocks in your various tissues that are governed by temperature and circadian rhythm are starting to split away from your central clock mechanisms. So it's actually important that your temperature match day length. Now, there's another way in which temperature matches, or daytime, excuse me. There's also an important way in which temperature matches day length. In general, as days get longer, it tends to be hotter out. Not always, but in general, that's the way it is. And as days get shorter, it tends to be colder outside. So temperature and day length are also linked. Metabolically, they're linked. Biologically, they're linked, and atmospherically, they're linked for the reasons that we talked about before about duration of day length and other climate features and so forth. So one of the most powerful things about setting your circadian rhythm properly is that your temperature will start to fall into a regular rhythm. And that temperature has a very strong effect on things like metabolism and when you will feel most willing and interested in exercising. Typically, the willingness to exercise and engage in any kind of activity, mental or physical, is going to be when that rise in temperature is steepest, when the slope of that line is greatest. That's why 30 minutes after waking is one of those key windows, as well as 3 hours after waking, and then when temperature actually peaks, which is generally about 11 hours after waking. So this is why we say that temperature and circadian rhythm are linked, but they're actually even more linked than that. We've talked before about how light enters the eye, triggers activation of these melanopsin cells, which then triggers activation of the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the master circadian clock. And then I always say the master circadian clock informs all the cells and tissues of your body and puts them into a nice cohesive rhythm. But what I've never answered was how it actually puts them into that rhythm. And it does it two ways. One is it secretes a peptide. A peptide is just a little protein that floats through the bloodstream and signals to the cells, okay, we're tuning your clock, kind of like a little, in a watch store, the watch store owner would tune the clocks. But the other way is it synchronizes the temperature under which those cells exist. So temperature is actually the effector of the circadian rhythm. Now, this is really important because changes in temperature by way of exercise, by way of eating, but especially by way of exercise, can start to shift our circadian rhythm pretty dramatically. But let's even go to a more extreme example. Nowadays, there's some interest in cold showers and ice baths. Not everybody is doing this, I realize. People seem to either love this or hate this. I don't mind the cold dunk thing. I get regular about this from time to time, and I'll do it. I haven't been doing it recently. It's always painful to do the first couple times, then you get kind of used to it. However, I've taken people to a cold dunk or an ice bath. I have a family member who wouldn't get in literally past her toes. She was like, this is just too aversive for me. Some people really like the cold. People vary tremendously. Getting into an ice bath is very interesting because you have a rebound increase in thermogenesis. Now, you should know from the previous episode that as that temperature increases, it will shift your circadian rhythm, and which direction it shifts your circadian rhythm will depend on whether or not you're doing it during the daytime or late in the day. If you do it after 8 p.m., it's going to make your day longer, right? Because your body and your central clocks are used to temperature going up early in the day and throughout the day and peaking in the afternoon. If you then increase that further, or you simply increase it over its baseline at 8 p.m. after temperature was already falling, even if it's just by a half a degree or a couple degrees, or you do that with exercise, doesn't have to be with the ice bath, you are extending, you are shifting forward, you are phase delaying your clock. You're convincing your clock and therefore the rest of your body that the day is still going, right? You're giving it the perception, the cellular and physiological perception that the day is getting longer, and you will want to naturally stay up later and wake up later. Now, you might say, wait, I do an ice bath late at night and I feel great and I fall deeply asleep. Well, cold can trigger the release of melatonin. There's a rebound increase in melatonin. So that could be the cause of that effect. You have to see what works for you. But if you do the ice bath early in the day and then get out, you will experience a more rapid rise, or cold shower early in the day, a more rapid rise in your body temperature. that will phase advance your clock and make it easier to get up early the following day. So for those of you that are having trouble getting up, and this is going to almost sound laughable, but a cold shower first thing in the morning will wake you up. But that's waking you up in the short term because of a different mechanism, which I'll talk about in a moment. But it also is shifting your clock. It's phase advancing your clock in a way that makes you more likely to get up earlier the next day. Okay. So in other words, increasing your temperature by getting in an ice bath, or cold shower, or exercising, which causes a compensatory increase in body temperature. Think about the normal pattern of body temperature, low around 4:35 a.m., starts to peak right around waking, starts to increase right around waking, then steep slope to a peak around 4 to 6 p.m. and then drops off. If you introduce an increase in body temperature by way of cold exposure early in the day, let's say 6 a.m. or 5 a.m., if you're, masochistic enough to get into a cold shower at that time, more power to you. It's going to make you want to wake up about half hour to an hour earlier the next day than you normally would. Whereas if you do it while your temperature is falling, it will tend to delay and make your body perceive as if the day is getting longer. These are phase advances and phase delays. We're going to get into this in far more detail when we talk about jet lag and shift work in episode 4, as well as other things. But temperature is not just one tool to manipulate wake up time and circadian rhythm and metabolism. It is the effector. It is the way that the central circadian clock impacts all the cells and tissues of your body. If you want to read further about this and you're really curious about the role of temperature, work by Joe Takahashi, who used to be at Northwestern University and is now at UT Southwestern in Dallas. Incredible scientist, and has really worked out a lot of the mechanisms around temperature and circadian rhythms. You can just Google his name and you'll see a whole bunch of studies there. I want to talk about cold and cold exposure because there's a great misconception about this that actually you can leverage once you understand how to use cold to either increase thermogenesis and fat loss, metabolism, or you can use it for stress mitigation and mood. And it really depends on one simple feature of how you approach the ice bath or cold shower. If you get into an ice bath or cold shower and you are calming yourself, you're actively calming the autonomic nervous system, maybe through some deep breathing, maybe through visualization, maybe you sing a song. People do this stuff. They use various tools. Some people find paying attention to an external stimulus is more helpful. Thinking about something, not the experience of the cold. Other people find that directly experiencing the cold in its most intense form and kind of going into the cold, quote unquote, is the best way to approach it. It really varies for people. There's no right or wrong way to go about this. But the goal of using cold exposure for stress inoculation and to raise your stress threshold, to be able to tolerate heightened levels of real life stress, not the ice bath, but real life stress like work stress and relational stress, etc., is by suppressing the activation of the so-called sympathetic nervous system, meaning the alertness or stress system. That involves buffering or trying to resist the shiver response. The shiver response is an autonomic response designed to generate heat, presumably, and actually that is what it does, in order to counter the cold. So when you use cold exposure and you're kind of muscling through it or you're learning to relax within it as a form of stress inoculation, that's great and works quite well for that purpose. And there's a reason why cold exposure is used in a variety of forms of military stress inoculation, most famous of which, of course, is the Navy SEAL BUDS test, really, which is a screening procedure for becoming a SEAL, involves a lot of exposure to cold water. However, if you're interested in using cold exposure for fat loss and thermogenesis, you want to do the exact opposite thing. There was a paper published in Nature 2 years ago, which showed that cold-induced shiver, the actual physical shiver, activates the release of a chemical in the body from muscle called succinate, S-U-C-C-I-N-A-T-E. Succinate travels in the bloodstream and then goes and activates a particular category of fat, not the typical kind of pink or white fat that we think of as like blubber in humans, the stuff that people seem to generally want less of, except for those genetic freaks that seem to have none of it, depending on what they consume. Congratulations. Brown fat is called brown fat because it's actually dark under the microscope. it's rich with mitochondria, and it exists mostly between the scapulae and in the upper neck, and it generates thermogenesis and heat in the body. It's rich with a certain category of adrenergic receptor. Incidentally, epinephrine binds to adrenergic receptors. These brown fat cells increase metabolism. It's called brown fat thermogenesis, and cause fat burning of other kinds of fat, the pink and white fat. So what does this all mean? This means if you want to use the ice bath in order to increase metabolism, shiver away. If you want to use the ice bath or cold shower in order to stress inoculate, resist the shiver and learn to stay calm, or quote unquote muscle through it. Now, I don't know that anyone's ever really talked about this publicly, because I think the data are so new, and I think that people assume that the ice bath or cold exposure is just one thing. Here I've talked about it 3 ways to shift your circadian rhythm depending on whether or not you're doing it early in the day while your temperature is still rising or at its peak, or after that peak in order to extend the perception of your day as continuing and make you want to go to sleep later and wake up later. Now, and then the third way, of course, is to either activate brown fat thermogenesis and increase metabolism. I suppose the fourth way would be to increase stress tolerance or stress threshold. Okay. But remember, temperature is the effector of circadian rhythms. Light is the trigger. The suprachiasmatic nucleus is the master circadian clock that mediates all these changes, also influenced by non-photic influence like exercise and feeding and things of that sort. But temperature is the effector. Now, you can also shift your circadian rhythm with eating. When you travel and you land in a new location and your schedule is inverted 12 hours, one way that we know you can shift your rhythm more quickly is to get onto the local meal schedule. Now, that probably has to do with 2 effects. One are changes in temperature, eating-induced increases in body temperature. Now you should understand why that would work, as well as eating has this anticipatory secretion of hypercretinorexin that I talked about it earlier. So if this is getting a little too down in the weeds, don't worry about it. I will get more into this in episode 4 of how to shift one's rhythm. But I would love for people to understand that light and temperature are the real heavy duty levers when it comes to moving your circadian rhythm and sleep times and activity schedules. And exercise and feeding can help, but really temperature and light, with light being the primary one, are the most important when it comes to sleep and wakefulness. Many people asked questions about food and neurotransmitters and how those relate to sleep, wakefulness, and mood, which is essentially 25 hours of content for me to cover. But I'm going to try and distill out the most common questions. We've talked a lot about neuromodulators like dopamine, acetylcholine, and norepinephrine. You may notice in those discussions that the precursors to, say, serotonin is tryptophan. Tryptophan actually comes from the diet. It comes from the foods that we eat. Tyrosine is the precursor to dopamine. It comes from the foods that we eat. And then once we ingest them, those compounds are circulated to a variety of different cells and tissues. But it is true that our food and the particular foods we eat can influence things like neuromodulator levels to some extent. It's not the only way, because there are also enzymes and biochemical pathways that are going to regulate how much tyrosine gets converted into dopamine. And there are elements of the dopaminergic neurons, the dopamine neurons themselves, that are electrical, that have influence on this as well. But there are a couple fair assumptions that we can make. First of all, nuts and meats, in particular red meats, tend to be rich in things like tyrosine, right? That tells you right there that because tyrosine is the precursor of dopamine and dopamine is the precursor of norepinephrine and epinephrine, that those foods tend to lend themselves toward the production of dopamine and epinephrine and the sorts of things that are associated with wakefulness. Now, of course, the volume of food that we eat also impacts our wakefulness. If we eat a lot of anything, whether or not it's ribeye steaks, rice, or cardboard, please don't eat cardboard, your stomach, if it's very distended, will draw a lot of blood into your gut, and you will divert blood from other tissues and you'll become sleepy. So it's not just about food content, it's also about food volume. All right. Fasting states generally are associated with more alertness, epinephrine, and so forth. And fed states are generally associated with more quiescence and relaxation, serotonin and the kind of things that lend themselves more towards sleep and less toward alertness. Foods that are rich in tryptophan tend to be things like white meat, turkey, also complex carbohydrates. So if you like, you can start experimenting, depending on what foods you eat. You can start experimenting with carbohydrate-rich meals for accessing sleep and more depth of sleep. This is actually something I personally do. I tend to eat pretty low carbish during the day. I actually fast until about noon, not because I have to work to do that, but because I'd rather just drink caffeine and water during that time. And then sometime around noon, I can't take it anymore and I'm hungry and I eat, and I try and eat low carb-ish unless I've worked out extremely hard in the previous 2 hours, which I rarely do, although I do sometimes. And that meal is then designed to prolong my period of wakefulness into the late afternoon. And then sometime around dinner time, which for me is around 6:30, 7 p.m., 8 p.m., sometimes as late as 9 p.m., I tend to eat things like white meat, fish, pastas, rice, and that kind of thing. My favorite food of all for accessing tryptophan is actually a starch. It's actually a vegetable. It's the croissant, which is my favorite vegetable. I don't eat those all the time, but I love them, and they seem to increase dopamine as well. Never actually done the mass spectrometry on a croissant, but they definitely increase tryptophan and relaxation for me. In all seriousness, low carbohydrate / fasted / ketogenic diets tend to lend themselves toward wakefulness by way of increasing epinephrine, norepinephrine, adrenaline, dopamine, and things of that sort. Carbohydrate-rich meals, and I suppose we should talk about meals as opposed to diet, tend to lend themselves more toward tryptophan, serotonin, and more lethargic states. There is very limited evidence that I am aware of that carbohydrates should be eaten at one time a day as it relates to metabolism, etc. I'm sure that will open up a certain amount of debate. If you work out very hard and you deplete glycogen, then this all changes. So some people are working out very hard and depleting glycogen, other people are not. That gets way outside the context of this particular podcast. But yes, indeed, different foods can bias different neuromodulators and thereby can modulate our waking or our feelings of lethargy and sleepiness.